uncover the latest mysteries before anyone else. By supporting our original Sherlock Holmes adventures on Patreon, you unlock early access to our stories long before their YouTube debut. Your monetary support is the secret to keeping this channel alive. The link to our Patreon is in the description below. In looking over the disorganized and often illegible notes of those cases which my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes investigated during the earlier years of our association, I find many which present features of a highly remarkable character. It is a source of frequent frustration to me that the very wealth of this material forces a severe selection. Indeed, as I noted upon the occasion of the Musgrave ritual, my dispatch box is entirely replete with records of early mysteries. Among those faded papers, wedged between the account of the Tarleton murders and the singular affair of the aluminium crutch, lies a thick dossier marked simply Ricoletti and his abominable wife. It was a case that cast a long and sinister shadow over the spring of that year, presenting a domestic nightmare so profound and an adversary so uniquely diabolical in her psychological cruelty that Holmes himself often referenced it in later years as a masterpiece of inverted criminality. It was in the early days of May. London had been swept by a series of sudden violent rainstorms, leaving the streets slick with dark mud and the air heavy with a premature, unseasonable damp. Holmes had been in a particularly irritable mood for some days. The criminal classes of the metropolis had seemingly taken a holiday, and my friend's restless, razor-sharp mind was tearing itself to pieces in the vacuum of inactivity. He had spent the entirety of the morning cross-indexing his vast book of references, smoking a succession of foul-smelling pipes, and pacing the sitting-room of our Baker Street lodgings like a caged panther. "It is a stagnant world, Watson," he remarked suddenly, stopping by the window and drumming his long, nervous fingers upon the glass. "Behold this great, dreary city, a million souls elbowing each other in the muck, and yet not one possesses the imagination to commit a crime worth the attention of a logical mind. It is all petty theft, drunken brawls, and the most transparent of frauds." "You are too harsh on human nature," I replied, looking up from my medical journal. "Surely the absence of spectacular crime is a blessing to the public." "To the public, perhaps, but to the specialist it is a slow death," he sighed, throwing himself into his armchair. "I require a problem, Watson, a knot to untangle. Without it, my mind is like a racing engine torn from its mountings, rattling itself to pieces for want of resistance." As if in answer to his plea, the sharp peal of the doorbell echoed from the ground floor. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson's heavy tread sounded upon the stairs, followed by a lighter, sharper step. The door opened to reveal the ferret-like features of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. His face was flushed, his bowler hat dripped with rainwater, and his eyes shone with the triumphant gleam of a man who believes he possesses a secret of supreme importance. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, stepping into the room and shedding his wet overcoat. "I hope I am not intruding upon your studies." "Not at all, Lestrade," Holmes replied languidly, his eyes half closed. "In fact, you arrive as a most welcome diversion. I perceive by the state of your boots that you have been walking in the heavy clay soil of the West End, and by the self-satisfied curve of your lip that you believe you have concluded a difficult arrest." Lestrade chuckled, though a flash of annoyance crossed his face at Holmes's customary deduction. "You are sharp as ever, Mr. Holmes, but this time I have indeed tied the ribbon on a most perplexing case. I came only to share the news, knowing your fondness for the bizarre. The bizarre is my lifeblood. Pray sit down and illuminate us." Lestrade took the seat opposite Holmes, leaning forward conspiratorially. "I presume you have read in the papers of the clubfoot burglaries?" "I read the papers, Lestrade, but I generally skip the police reports. They are written with a shocking lack of literary style. However, I am aware of the particulars. 3 houses in Mayfair broken into. High-value jewellery stolen. In each case a remarkably violent assault upon the night watchman, and in each case the unmistakable muddy footprint of a man with a severe talipes equinovarus, a clubfoot, left upon the carpets." "Exactly," Lestrade said, slapping his knee. "A monstrous fellow. The watchman described a shadow, moving with a heavy, dragging limp, but possessing the strength of a gorilla. One man had his jaw broken in 3 places. For a fortnight London has been terrified of this club-footed fiend. Well, Mr. Holmes, the terror's over. I have the man under lock and key." "Indeed," Holmes said, his eyelids drooping further, a sure sign of his awakening interest. "And who is the fortunate gentleman?" "An Italian immigrant of some wealth and a highly unpleasant reputation. A merchant named Pietro Ricoletti. He resides in a dark, formidable house on Wimpole Street." "Ah," Holmes murmured. "Pietro Ricoletti, known in the city for his ruthless business practices, and known in his neighbourhood for a temper that borders on the pathological. He does indeed possess a club-foot." "He does, but that is not all," Lestrade continued triumphantly. "Last night the scoundrel attempted his 4th robbery at the estate of Lord Blackwood. The police were alerted by a whistle. We arrived to find the safe blown, the jewels gone, and the heavy dragging footprints leading out into the garden. We tracked those prints, Mr. Holmes. They led, via a series of muddy alleys and carriage hires, directly to Wimpole Street. I procured a warrant this morning, entered Ricoletti's home, and found the man asleep. In his study, hidden behind a volume of Dante, we found a portion of Lord Blackwood's jewels, and in his dressing-room a pair of boots, the right one specially made for a club-foot, still caked in the yellow clay of Blackwood's garden." Lestrade leaned back, crossing his arms. "Motive, opportunity, and physical evidence in abundance. You must admit, Mr. Holmes, even you could not tie a neater bow upon it. He is a cruel, violent man. He protested loudly, of course, raving like a madman, claiming he had been asleep all night, but the evidence is absolute." Holmes remained silent for a long minute, staring up at the ceiling, the smoke from his pipe rising in slow blue coils. "And what of his wife?" he asked quietly. Lestrade blinked, surprised by the question. "Mrs. Emilia Ricoletti? A tragic figure, truly. A woman of exquisite breeding and gentle disposition, shackled to a brute. She was devastated, weeping bitterly upon my shoulder. She confessed in the strictest confidence that she had suspected her husband's nocturnal wanderings for weeks, but feared for her life if she spoke out. He is a tyrant, Mr. Holmes. He abuses her terribly. She showed me a bruise upon her wrist that would make your blood boil. She is entirely cooperative with the Yard." "How very convenient," Holmes whispered. "I beg your pardon?" Holmes sprang suddenly to his feet, all languor vanishing in an instant. His eyes glittered with a fierce, calculating light. "Lestrade, you have caught a fish, but I fear you are entirely blind to the angler on the bank." "I do not follow you, sir. The man's boots were in the house. The jewels were in the house. His footprints were at the scene." "Precisely. It is too perfect, Lestrade.
It is a child's painting of a crime. Consider the facts. Pietro Ricoletti is a wealthy man. Why should he burgle his neighbours for jewellery he does not need? Furthermore, he is a man of business, not a cracksman. To blow a safe requires a specialised knowledge of nitroglycerin. But most absurd of all, Lestrade, do you truly believe that a man possessing a unique, identifiable physical deformity would deliberately leave muddy prints upon white carpets at 3 separate crime scenes, and then carry those boots home to leave them uncleaned in his dressing room? Lestrade flushed angrily. Criminals make mistakes, Mr. Holmes. Hubris, they call it. Hubris is leaving a cigar butt, Lestrade. Leaving a custom-made orthopedic boot covered in clay is not hubris, it is an advertisement. The man has been framed, and framed by a hand so malicious, so utterly devoid of conscience, that the very thought of it makes my blood run cold. Framed? By whom? By the weeping angel who shed tears upon your shoulder, Holmes declared, reaching for his Inverness cape. Come, Watson, there is not a moment to lose. The tragedy of Ricoletti is far deeper than a blown safe. If I am not mistaken, we are about to gaze into the abyss of a truly abominable soul. Our cab rattled over the wet cobblestones, carrying us toward Wimpole Street. The rain had ceased, but a low grey mist clung to the rooftops, shrouding the city in a gloom that perfectly matched my own forebodings. Holmes sat beside me, his jaw set, his eyes fixed unseeingly upon the passing traffic. "You believe the wife is responsible?" I asked, breaking the silence. "I do not believe, Watson. I deduce," he replied sharply. "Who else has unfettered access to Ricoletti's private study and his dressing room? Who else could remove his boots, execute a crime, and return the boots while he slept? A servant might be bribed, but the psychological element points directly to the wife." The psychological element? Lestrade noted that Ricoletti is a tyrant and a brute. I do not dispute this. By all accounts, Pietro Ricoletti is a thoroughly unpleasant man. But observe the inversion, Watson. A typical abused wife seeks escape, or, in extreme cases, a sudden, desperate violence. She poisons the tea or strikes with a poker in a moment of passion. But this is a prolonged, calculated campaign of destruction. To frame a man for violent burglary is to guarantee him a sentence of hard labour, perhaps the gallows, if a watchman were to die of his injuries. It is not merely murder, it is the absolute annihilation of his reputation, his freedom, and his sanity. She is using the machinery of the state as her murder weapon, and she is playing the victim all the while. It is a sadism of the highest intellectual order. The Ricoletti residence was a tall, imposing structure of dark brick, its windows heavily curtained, projecting an aura of secrecy and gloom. We were admitted by a pale, trembling maid who led us into a lavishly appointed, though oppressively dark, drawing-room. A moment later, Mrs. Emilia Ricoletti entered. I must confess that, despite Holmes's warnings, I was taken aback by her appearance. She was a woman in her early 30s, possessing a fragile, ethereal beauty. Her skin was as white as porcelain, contrasting sharply with the heavy mourning dress she wore, a premature adoption of black that I found highly irregular. Her dark eyes were wide and swimming with unshed tears, and she moved with a delicate, hesitant grace. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said, her voice a soft, tremulous whisper. "Inspector Lestrade told me you might come. I do not know how to face the shame." She sank into a velvet chair, producing a lace handkerchief and dabbing at her eyes. "Madam," Holmes said, his voice clipped and entirely devoid of the sympathy she clearly expected, "I am here
to examine the premises. I understand your husband is currently a guest of Her Majesty." "Yes," she sobbed, "it is a nightmare. I have prayed for years that Pietro's violent nature would not spill over into the world. But alas, the things they found in his study, the boots, I can scarcely bear to think of it." "I am sure it must be highly distressing," Holmes replied, his grey eyes sweeping over her with the cold detachment of a scientist examining a specimen. "Tell me, Mrs. Ricoletti, is your husband a heavy sleeper?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her gaze darting to Holmes's face. He suffers from insomnia, Mr. Holmes. He takes a tincture of laudanum each night to sleep." "Who prepares this tincture?" "I do. It is my wifely duty." "Indeed. And on the nights of the burglaries, did he consume his usual draught?" "He did. He sleeps the sleep of the dead. It is during those hours that I suppose he departed the house to commit these awful acts." "Fascinating," Holmes murmured. "He takes laudanum to sleep, yet wakes in the dead of night, embarks upon physically grueling burglaries that involve beating watchmen senseless and blowing safes, returns home, and resumes his drug-induced slumber, remembering nothing by morning. A remarkable constitution." Mrs. Ricoletti stiffened. The fragility vanished for a fleeting second, replaced by a look of hard, calculating intelligence, before the mask of sorrow fell back into place. "I am not a doctor, Mr. Holmes. I only know the terror I have lived with. Look here." She pulled back her black sleeve, revealing an ugly yellowish bruise upon her forearm. "He is a monster, sir. The police have finally seen the truth." "I see," Holmes said pleasantly. "May I examine the dressing-room where the boots were found?" "Of course. The maid will show you up." As we ascended the stairs, Holmes leaned close to my ear. "Did you observe the bruise, Watson?" "I did. A nasty contusion, at least a week old." "And did you observe its shape? It was circular, roughly an inch in diameter. The mark of a blunt instrument, or perhaps a heavy door shutting upon it. It was not the grip of a man's hand, which would leave distinct finger marks. She is weaving a tapestry of lies, Watson, and using her husband's own foul temper as the thread." The dressing-room was a meticulous affair. Holmes immediately fell to his knees, producing his magnifying lens from his pocket. He ignored the cabinets and went straight to the floor, crawling about like a hound on a scent. He examined the carpet near the doorway, the dustboards, and the window-sill. "Lestrade's men have trampled the place like a herd of buffalo," he muttered angrily. "But there, Watson, look here!" He pointed to a tiny smear of greyish powder near the leg of a heavy wardrobe. I knelt beside him. "Cigar ash?" I ventured. No, man. Rub it between your fingers. It is coarse, gritty. Plaster of Paris, Watson. And here, upon the hem of the curtain, a faint smudge of dark, theatrical grease paint." He sprang up, his eyes shining. "The picture clears. Oh, she is an artist, Watson, an absolute virtuoso of deception." "You mean she wore his boots?" "She did not need to wear his boots, Watson. She needed only to make his boots walk." Holmes paced the room excitedly. "Pietro Ricoletti is a large man. His wife is a delicate woman. Even if she put on his heavy club-footed boot, her stride length, her weight distribution, would be entirely wrong. Any competent tracker, even Lestrade on a good day, would notice that the depth of the impression did not match a 14-stone man. No, she could not make the prints herself. Then who did? An accomplice? An accomplice is a weakness. This woman trusts no one. No, Watson, she created a prosthetic. She took a casting of his clubfoot boot using plaster of Paris, hence the dust. She then likely affixed this casting to a heavy pole or a rig, which she could press into the mud with the required weight and stride length, leaving perfect identical prints at the crime scenes. The grease paint was used to darken her own face and clothing when she slipped out into the night to plant the evidence and blow the safes. "But blowing safes requires skill," I protested. "Skill that can be learned, or perhaps she did not blow them at all. Perhaps she possessed the keys, stole the jewels, and then used a small explosive charge merely for theatrical effect to simulate a violent entry. We must investigate the watchmen who were assaulted. I would wager my professional reputation they were not beaten by a man with a clubfoot, but struck from behind in the dark by a swift, silent assailant." "Holmes," I said slowly, realizing the monstrous nature of the crime. "If you are correct, she has subjected her husband to a psychological torture beyond imagining. To wake up repeatedly accused of atrocities, to find muddy boots in his room, to be drugged. She has been driving him mad before handing him over to the hangman." "Exactly, Watson, and our task is to prove it before Ricoletti faces the magistrate tomorrow." Our investigation consumed the remainder of the day and took us into the lowest, most dangerous quarters of London. Holmes's first priority was to track down the jewels. He reasoned that a woman of Mrs. Ricoletti's calculating nature would not keep the bulk of the stolen Blackwood jewels in her own home. The few pieces found in Ricoletti's study were merely bait for Lestrade. The rest would be fenced. Disguised as a rough-looking seafaring man, a transformation he accomplished in a filthy public house near Covent Garden, Holmes plunged into the underworld. I waited in the back room of a dreary tavern, keeping a nervous watch on the door for 3 hours until Holmes returned, smelling of stale ale and cheap tobacco. "I have found the thread, Watson," he whispered, wiping a smudge of dirt from his cheek. "The jewels were sold to a fence named Barking Ned, operating out of a pawnshop in Whitechapel. I applied a little persuasion. He described the seller. Not a hulking Italian with a club foot, but a young lad, heavily muffled, with soot on his face. But Barking Ned is a sharp one. He noticed the lad had hands as white and smooth as milk, and smelled faintly of jasmine perfume. Mrs. Ricoletti. Without a doubt. Furthermore, I visited the hospital and spoke to the watchman injured at the Blackwood estate. He confirmed my suspicion. He never saw his attacker. He was struck on the back of the skull with a lead pipe while investigating a noise. The heavy, dragging footsteps he reported hearing were heard after he fell, as he was losing consciousness. A theatrical performance staged for an audience of one half-dead man. "Then we have enough to go to Lestrade," I cried. "Not nearly," Holmes said grimly, hailing a cab. "Lestrade has the boots, the jewels in the study, and Ricoletti's violent reputation. We have circumstantial deductions and the word of a frightened fence. If we confront her now, she will weep, play the victim, and a jury will sympathize with the beautiful abused wife. No, Watson, we cannot simply prove that Ricoletti is innocent. We must catch the abominable wife in the absolute commission of a crime. We must force her hand.
Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat at his desk and composed a letter with rapid slashing strokes of his pen. We must create a crisis, Watson. A psychological pressure that even her icy nerves cannot withstand. He sealed the envelope. I am sending this to Mrs. Ricoletti via messenger. It is written on cheap paper in an uneducated hand. It reads, I have the plaster mould you left hidden at your dressmaker's shop. £50 tonight at the old boathouse by the Battersea Reach, or I take it straight to your husband in his cell. Blackmail! A targeted strike, Watson. Notice I did not threaten to go to the police. I threatened to go to Ricoletti. If a blackmailer alerts her husband to her treason, his wrath upon his release will be terrible, and her entire elaborate construct is in jeopardy. A woman so protective of her own skin, who trusts absolutely no one, will not hire a thug to retrieve such damning physical evidence. She will come herself to silence the threat. She will kill the blackmailer. She will certainly try. Holmes smiled, opening his desk drawer and withdrawing his heavy Webley revolver. He checked the cylinder and slipped it into his pocket. I suggest you bring your army service revolver as well, my dear doctor. The lady may be delicate, but a rattlesnake is also a delicate creature. Tonight we go hunting in the fog. By 10 o'clock that evening, the weather had taken a turn for the worse. The earlier damp had thickened into a dense, choking London fog, a true pea souper. It rolled off the Thames in heavy yellow waves, obscuring the gas lamps until they were nothing but sickly glowing halos in the gloom. The air tasted of soot and sulphur, and the raw chill seemed to penetrate our very bones, mirroring the icy nature of the woman we hunted. We made our way to Battersea Reach with agonizing slowness, our cab driver leading the horse by the bridle for the last half-mile. The river was a black, invisible presence, betrayed only by the rhythmic lapping of water against rotting wooden pilings and the mournful bellow of a distant foghorn. The old boathouse was a derelict structure, half-collapsed and jutting out over the muddy banks of the Thames. Holmes and I concealed ourselves behind a stack of rotting timber, the damp seeping through our heavy coats. "We must be perfectly silent, Watson," Holmes whispered, his lips almost touching my ear. "In this fog, sight is useless. Our ears are our only sentinels." We waited in the freezing gloom. An hour passed, then another. The silence was absolute, save for the dripping of moisture from the wooden beams. I began to fear that Holmes's gambit had failed, that the icy Mrs. Ricoletti had seen through the ruse or had simply chosen to flee. Suddenly Holmes's hand tightened on my arm. I strained to listen. At first there was nothing, then a soft squelching sound in the mud. It was methodical, deliberate. Step, step, step. A shadow detached itself from the thicker darkness of the fog. It was a figure wrapped in a heavy dark ulster, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. The figure paused, peering into the cavernous gloom of the boathouse. "Are you there?" a voice called out. It was a harsh, raspy whisper, disguised, but undeniably feminine in its underlying cadence. "I have the money. Show me the mould." Holmes stepped out from behind the timber, striking a match. The sudden flare of light illuminated his sharp, hawk-like profile. "There is no blackmailer, Mrs. Ricoletti," Holmes said, his voice cutting through the fog like a blade. "Only the end of your abominable performance." For a second the figure stood frozen. The match burned down to Holmes's fingertips, and he dropped it, plunging us back into the twilight. Then,
With the speed of a striking viper, the woman moved. She did not flee back the way she came. Instead, she reached into the folds of her ulster. I saw the glint of dull metal. "Look out, Holmes!" I shouted, throwing myself forward. A sharp crack shattered the silence, and a tongue of flame spat from the woman's hand. The bullet splintered the wood a mere inch from Holmes's head. Before she could cock the pistol a second time, Holmes lunged forward, but his boots slipped upon the treacherous river mud. Taking immediate advantage of his momentary imbalance, Mrs. Ricoletti spun on her heel and bolted into the thickest part of the fog, heading down the treacherous mud bank alongside the river. "After her, Watson! Do not let her escape!" Holmes roared. What followed was the most hellish chase of my life. We plunged blindly into the swirling yellow vapours, slipping and sliding upon the treacherous river mud. The fog was so dense I could not see my own hand stretched out before me. The stench of raw sewage and rotting fish filled my nostrils. I followed the sound of Holmes's boots ahead of me and the frantic, splashing footsteps of the woman further on. "Stop, Mrs. Ricoletti!" Holmes's voice echoed weirdly in the mist, seeming to come from all directions. "The river is high. You will drown." A mocking, breathless laugh drifted back to us. She was completely unhinged now, the mask of the sorrowful wife entirely discarded. She was a creature of pure, vicious survival. Suddenly I tripped over a discarded crate and fell headlong into the muck. I scrambled to my feet, but in that moment of disorientation I lost the sound of the footsteps. "Holmes!" I cried out. "Here, Watson! To your left!" I staggered toward his voice. I found Holmes standing at the very edge of a crumbling stone pier that jutted out into the black swirling water of the Thames. He was peering intently down into the abyss. "Has she jumped?" I gasped, coming to his side. "Quiet!" he commanded. Below us, beneath the pier, I heard the faint scraping of wood. She had not jumped. She was clambering down the rotten scaffolding beneath the pier, intending to slip away into the labyrinth of the docks. Holmes dropped to his stomach and reached down into the darkness. There was a sudden shriek of rage, a violent scuffle, and a splash. I aimed my revolver down into the fog. "Shall I fire, Holmes?" "No, I have her." With a tremendous heave, Holmes hauled a struggling, furious bundle of wet wool and malice up onto the pier. Mrs. Ricoletti fought like a wild cat, clawing and biting, her hat lost, her hair plastered to her skull with mud and river water. It took the combined strength of both Holmes and myself to pin her down and bind her wrists with my handkerchief. The delicate, ethereal porcelain doll we had met in the drawing-room was entirely gone. Even as she lay captive in the mud, defeated and ruined, she did not weep. She turned her face toward Holmes, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure and concentrated it made me shudder. "You meddling, arrogant fool!" she hissed, her voice devoid of any assumed frailty. "He deserved it. He is a beast. I would have seen his neck snap on the gallows, and I would have smiled." "He may be a beast, madam," Holmes said coldly, dusting the mud from his knees, "but he is not a thief, nor a murderer. The law will punish him for his cruelties to you, if they are proven, but it will not hang him for your crimes. You have constructed an infernal machine to destroy a man's soul, but you made one fatal error." "And what was that?" she sneered. "You believed yourself to be the most intelligent person in London. A common failing among criminals, and one that invariably leads them to Baker Street. Come, Watson, let us deliver this venomous creature to Lestrade. It was near dawn when we finally returned to our lodgings. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was chill. I poured us both a stiff measure of brandy, while Holmes threw off his ruined cape and sank wearily into his armchair. The handover at the yard had been a tableau of high drama. Lestrade, utterly bewildered and profoundly embarrassed, had taken Mrs. Ricoletti into custody. Holmes had then handed the inspector a slip of paper detailing the bruising on the woman's arm. A man's home is his castle, Lestrade, but it is not his torture chamber, Holmes had warned the inspector. When Ricoletti is released from his false charges, see that he answers for his real ones. A singular case, Watson, Holmes murmured now, staring into the embers, a pipe clenched between his teeth. A study in the absolute corruption of the human spirit. I cannot comprehend it, Holmes, I said, taking a sip of the burning spirit. To live with a man, to share his home, and all the while to be methodically engineering his execution. It is diabolical. It is the intellect divorced from morality, Watson. It is a terrifying thing. Mrs. Ricoletti possessed a brilliant mind. Had she turned it to legitimate endeavours, she might have been a titan of industry or a great artist. Instead, she focused the entirety of her genius upon a canvas of revenge and greed. Do you think Ricoletti's abuse drove her to it? It was the catalyst, no doubt. A righteous person seeks justice or escape. Only a monster seeks to frame a man for crimes he did not commit, to slowly drive him mad with laudanum, and to use the hangman as a personal assassin. They are two halves of a poisoned coin, Watson, the brute and the serpent. I looked down at my glass, suddenly chilled despite the brandy, finding myself unable to disagree with his grim assessment. Holmes reached over and picked up his violin. He drew the bow across the strings, producing a low, melancholy chord that seemed to capture the lingering chill of the London fog and the dark abyss of the human heart we had gazed into that night. "Let us close the book on the Ricolettis, my friend," he said softly, beginning to play a complex, mournful sonata. "The sun is rising, the fog is clearing, and who knows, perhaps today the world will offer us a problem devoid of such ugly human wickedness." I sat back and listened to the music, watching the first grey light of morning creep through the windows of Baker Street, profoundly grateful for the brilliant, eccentric mind of the man playing the violin, standing as a bulwark against the darkness. Thanks for joining me for another original mystery. Do not forget to check out our Patreon down below to support the channel.